We're about to start this morning's proceedings. I'm Nicole Gurran. I'm from the Faculty of Architecture, Design and Planning and one of the three co-chairs of this symposium. But before I say anything more, I want to introduce Michael from the Metropolitan Aboriginal Land Council to give us a traditional welcome to country.
Good morning, brothers and sisters. How are you? That's great. And I know it's been a little bit foggy here in Sydney this morning, but that's how it is, isn't it? This beautiful land that we're on, obviously, is the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, one of the 29 clans of the Eora Nation. Other clans are across that beautiful harbour. There's a suburb of Cammeray. That's named after the Cammeraygal people. Also on the northern beaches is Gadigal National Park. That's named after the people over there, the clan over there. KMA and Canigal are two of the three clans at Manly. Also we have Barramadigal, where Parramatta is Barra meaning eel, where the eel people are out there. And in between Barramadigal and Gadigal here we have Wongal. And across the river at Ryde is Wallamadigal. Just to give you a bit of an understanding of the different clans that are in Sydney here. And the onus is on all Australians to understand about and learn from the oldest living continuous culture in the world today and to be proud of it. When people from overseas look here, they see an ancient land, they see Aboriginal people and Aboriginal culture and the Torres Strait Islander culture here. If they've been here for more than 60 millennia, it's important to understand that. And it's about community, it's about respecting Mother Earth and understanding Mother Earth and understanding the cycles of Mother Nature. And it's about being connected. Everything is connected in the scheme of things in the universe. From the drop of water, from the particle of dust, to the trees out there, the leaves, to me, to you, to the person sitting beside you. The beautiful whales that are going up and down the coast here, that come in the harbour. Some people believe that the whales are elders who are transformed into whales and come in the harbour here, and they're part of the totems of different clans along the coastal clans. From the dugong to the kangaroo, to everything, we're all connected in the scheme of things when you think about it. It's also important that we do take a moment's silence to pay our respects to not only the Gadigal of the Eora, but to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander traditional owners, elders and custodians for looking after the land, the spirit of the country and the culture. When you think here, the Gadigal people have returned to this land for many millennia and their spirit is here amongst us right now. Also, when you're walking down George Street, you are walking down an ancient Aboriginal track that's been there for many millennia. So you're walking in the footsteps of many Aboriginal people before you're walking there. The Opera House, also, that was a great midden there. It's also important when we do take a moment's silence to reflect our journey and our family's journey from where we've come from around this little blue ball that we share called Earth, coming here. And it's important that we do pay respects to all ancestors. When you think about us who we are sitting here right now, we are the sum of all those who have gone before us, both in our very DNA, our culture and our society. And I guess what your conference is about helping build communities, helping build them correctly, so everything's taken into effect there and understanding. So if we just have a moment's silence to pay our respects and to reflect. Water is life. It falls from the heavens, it lands on Mother, it finds its way to the rivers. The Eora Nation, we have 4 aquatic boundaries, 3 of those are rivers. We have to the north, the Hawkesbury River, to the south, the Georges River, to the east, the Pacific Ocean, and to the west, Nepean. So within these 4 aquatic boundaries lies the mighty Eora Nation. To any of my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters out there, I warmly welcome you from the lands, the clan, the tribe, the nation you come from. To my non-Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters, my fellow Australian brothers and sisters, and our friends from across the waters, I warmly welcome you from the land, the family, the neighbourhood and the community you come from, to this land, the ancestral land of the Gadigal people, Eora land, Aboriginal land, always was, is and will be Aboriginal land until the end of time. And it's whether you've journeyed just across old Sydney town here, or across this wonderful Waratah state, or across this amazing sunburnt country we share as Australians. Think about the beautiful places we have here. Uluru, very sacred to the Aboriginal people there. The Kimberleys, the Red Centre, the Outback, the Great Barrier Reef, the Great Divide. What wonderful places we share as Australians. Or your journey may have been from across the other lands, across the waters, coming here to right now. Life is a journey. At this point in time, we've all come together in the continuum here right now on this land. So on behalf of Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, I welcome all my brothers and sisters to this land. Traditionally, a welcome to country, it's about two things. It's about learning the history of the land, and it's also about the rules. The rules of the land are to being on the land is respect the land, respect each other, work together for a better community, a better society, and respect others treat others the way you want to be treated, and let's all work together for a better planet. And it starts with the person you see every morning in the mirror. Thanks. I was just going to explain about the smoking for our international visitors here, and that smoking is traditionally, when you think about cycles of life and everything, fire is one of them. Fire is about regeneration and rebirth. Smoking is about cleansing of here, and it's about cleansing of the people. So it's about dispersing all the negative energy, and it's about starting on a positive note. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. From all of us, I don't think I can think of a better way to welcome a group of Australians and international planners, policymakers to a symposium like this. So we really appreciate your words. So as I said before, I'm Nicole Gurran. I'm from the Faculty of Architecture, Design and Planning here at the University of Sydney, and I'm one of 3 chairs of this 10th International Urban Planning and Environment Association Symposium. And I'm so delighted to welcome all of you here this morning. I'd like to also introduce my other 2 co-chairs of this symposium, Professor Peter Phipps, currently at the University of Western Sydney, and he's over there, and Associate Professor Susan Thompson, who is also here somewhere. Up there she is. Hi, Susan. And so on behalf of the 3 of us, welcome here to Sydney. We also welcome our distinguished guests in the audience, our keynote and our roundtable speakers, those of you who've travelled great distances to be here. We also welcome the many local policymakers, those of you from New South Wales Government, from local councils, practitioners, and those of you from consultancy firms, both here in New South Wales and also around Australia. I've had the pleasure of looking at the delegate list, and I'm delighted by the mix of people we have here. UPE10 is being co-hosted by my own faculty, Architecture, Design and Planning, as well as the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. And so as you'll see, Professor Ed Blakely, who's currently with the United States Studies Centre, he was once with us in the Faculty of Architecture, Design and Planning, and also the Honourable Robert Hill will play a very strong role in the program. We've been very lucky, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge our sponsors. We've been very lucky to be sponsored by the New South Wales Government, including the Department of Trade and Investment, the Department of Planning and Infrastructure. We've had fantastic support from the City of Sydney, the Green Building Council of Australia, and many others. So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank our sponsors. I want to make some brief comments about the symposium program of events, and of course I need to tell you some important operational housekeeping details. And then I'm going to hand over to our next two speakers to provide an international and another local welcome. UPE10 follows a series of symposia that have been held around the world since 1994. I first went to my first UPE symposia in Oxford exactly a decade ago. I was a baby academic. I can't quite say I was a baby, but I was a baby academic then, fresh from New South Wales state government, and, you know, perhaps feeling a little bit at sea in the hallowed halls of the University of Sydney. You know, the academic culture took some getting used to. So it was wonderful to go to Oxford University at a very scholarly conference, but also a conference that was very much at the interface between research and practice. In those days, so we're only talking a decade ago, the sustainability agenda was still fairly fresh, and particularly fresh in practice. We were only just starting to talk about what greenhouse gas emissions might mean for spatial planners, for instance. Climate risk, you know, certainly hadn't hit the agenda where I was working in the New South Wales state government at that point in time, although it may have hit my boss's agenda, Craig Knowles, who I'll introduce in a moment, who was actually the Minister for Planning at the time. But at the same time, the scholarly concerns of academics that I was encountering at university seemed rather esoteric and distant to practice. So it was wonderful to meet so many researchers, but also practitioners from around the world who are interested in the relationship between spatial planning decisions and the environment, from questions about sustainable urban brownfields remediation through to environmental justice. Since then, I've attended several UPE symposia in Bangkok, in Kaiserslautern, Germany. In fact, we've got some people from Germany here in the audience this morning, also Guangzhou in China. And one of the really important things, and I think you'll observe this over the next 2 days, is that the reference points at UPE symposia are not dominated by an Anglo perspective or an American perspective or even a European perspective. They're absolutely global. And the idea of expanding our points of reference and learning from one another, learning from our differences as much as our commonalities, is very much underpins our UPE philosophy. So I'm pleased to say that UPE10 in Sydney actually has delegates from about 18 countries around the world, and I might name some of them. Australia, of course, is very well represented, and I'm delighted by that, but we've also got people here from Papua New Guinea, from China, from New Zealand, from Israel, from South America, England, America, of course, how could I forget, New Zealand, Singapore, and of course you'll meet many more of the delegates from the nations that I've missed. In New South Wales at the moment, we're in the midst of an incredible period of planning system reform. We've had what at its time was a very revolutionary piece of planning legislation, the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act. It's now 30 years old and we're in the midst of renewing that. So as we go into a period of great debate about what planning systems should look like and how we as spatial planners should address a lot of the issues that we're going to be discussing in this symposia, I'm absolutely delighted to see the sorts of things that we've got on the program. So front and centre, for instance, in our New South Wales planning reform agenda is community engagement. So if we want to hear about community engagement here, we only need to go to Professor Don Miller's talk about how they've engaged communities in planning in Seattle since their Historic Growth Management Act in the early 90s. And there are many other offerings of that ilk. So I want to just say something more about the program before I tell you the operational details and hand on to our other welcome speakers. Here in Maclaurin Hall, we've got 4 keynote speeches, and they're really framing up the discussion. So starting off this morning with climate change and the implications for planning and design, moving on to national environmental policy and comparative approaches to that. Tomorrow we'll delve more deeper into what a zero carbon future might look like and how we might get there. And our final keynote session tomorrow afternoon with Wendy Steele is going to provoke us to think about what we actually need to do next as planners and policymakers. We're then going to talk Turkey in some roundtable discussions. We've got 3 roundtable discussions that go into the nitty-gritty, if you like, with policymakers, academics and planners. We're looking at things like how we build sustainable communities, borrowing from a discussion that started in Melbourne about 6 months ago. Tomorrow morning there'll be a discussion about governance in metropolitan contexts, and then tomorrow afternoon, what type of behavioural change do we all need to engage in to realise a sustainable future? But UPE symposia are fundamentally about exchanging emerging ideas about our research and practice. And so here in Sydney we've got around 90 research and practice focused papers that will be presented in parallel paper and discussion sessions. Having had the pleasure of reading all of them and matching abstracts and papers to faces last night, which was delightful, personally looking forward to hearing to Elisabeth, who's going to talk to us about how the planning system should deal with fracking and other risky things. That's tomorrow afternoon. She's all the way from Austin, Texas. We've got Andrew Allen from Adelaide. I'm not sure if he's arrived yet, but he's going to talk about, how we might plan for electric cars and how they may shape our urban form in the future. We've got Peng Jun Zhao, who's talking to us about regional urbanism in China and megacities. If you can't find anything to interest you in our program, then I'm going to throw up my hands because there's quite a lot. I suspect more likely you're going to be very annoyed with myself and our 3 co-chairs, because unfortunately we've had to put a lot of sessions on that we think you're going to feel torn about making some decisions. So operationally, I want to orient you around the main quadrangle, which is where we're going to pretty much be settled for all of the speaking part of this symposium. Here in Maclaurin Hall, we'll have all of the keynote sessions. The roundtable sessions are all going to be held in the McRae room, which is actually on this level, but it's most easily accessed downstairs in the cloisters. So that veranda area where you had your tea and coffee this morning, that's delightfully known as cloisters. From there, you'll find your way up to Maclaurin Hall for roundtable sessions. All of the paper and discussion sessions, if you're looking for where you need to get to, they're all off the cloisters downstairs. We've got 3 rooms. You'll have no trouble finding them because anyone who's wearing a green lanyard is a volunteer. They'll be on hand to show you where you need to get to. So there'll be also the McRae room and the 3 rooms downstairs off the cloisters near the famous jacaranda tree in the quadrangle. I need to tell you to wear your own lanyard, of course, all of the time. And as I said, if you've got any questions, ask someone with wearing a green lanyard, or also ask our conference organisers who are at the registration desk. We've got some fantastic social events. Tonight's dinner, it's not just a social event, of course. We've got a round table, a debate really about cities and revitalising cities. I hope you can all come. If you don't have a ticket, please go and see them at the registration desk. I think it's closed off, but they'll probably be able to do something for you because we want to see you there. We'll all congregate down in the main quadrangle. We'll walk across together to the home building. It's less than a 5 minutes walk. And if you're coming from somewhere else, there's a map in your delegate bag. The other thing I want to tell you about is the study tours. Our sponsors, the Green Building Council of Australia, for instance, have put on a walking tour of green buildings downtown. I mean, that is an unmissable opportunity as far as I'm concerned. But there's also 4 other study tours, including 3 that have been sponsored by the Department of Planning and Infrastructure. Their own staff will take you around to the sites that they're grappling with, and I'm sure they'll want to hear your perspectives. So please, if you haven't booked a study tour, please go and talk to the registration desk. And of course, tomorrow evening, we've got a fantastic public event where you'll see a lot of Sydney-siders coming to join the conversation about cities, as well as some catered book launches beforehand. So timing, I want to say something about that, because with such a full program, timing, of course, is very important. Each and every speaker, including myself, in just a moment, I'm sure, will be given a warning time when their allocated time expires, and we'll have to ask you to respect that to give everybody an opportunity to participate in the discussion. But you'll also notice that the parallel sessions have been timed so that if you do need to move between sessions to catch another paper, that is possible. We've tried to organise them thematically, but we understand if there is another paper that you need to get to. So we have organised the parallel sessions to allow a bit of movement, and of course all of the rooms are joining one another, so that should be possible. Of course, the most important thing is the bathrooms. Here and down off the cloisters, morning and afternoon tea and lunch down in the cloisters. If it's cold or if you want to come up and have a seat, you're very welcome to bring your tea, coffee and lunch up here, have a look at the books. Incidentally, I should say that the book table features books by all of you, and it's an outstanding collection. So we've got all of our speakers who've written books and many participants in the audience. Basically, it's an incredible book fair of urban planning literature made up of the people you see here in this room. And of course, in the unlikely event of an emergency, please follow the signs of the emergency exit and congregate in the wonderful front lawn in front of the quadrangle. Now I have the great pleasure of introducing Professor Don Miller, who's the co-founder and chair of the International Urban Planning and Environment Association. From the University of Washington, Seattle, Professor Miller's extensive contributions to the field have been largely in the area of environmental justice. As co-founder of IUPE nearly 20 years ago, Professor Miller has fostered a series of international collaborations and symposia such as today's, but that have resulted in an incredible outpouring of research productivity, including more than 20 books published under Ashgate's Urban Planning and Environment series. So, Don, can I welcome you?
Well, I will be brief because we're already running a little late. My role is certainly not to welcome you. That would be presumptuous. But we've been gracefully and graciously welcomed both last evening and today. And so my role instead is to thank you for coming and thank you for participating in advance. This is the 10th in this series of symposiums. The first we organized in Seattle, as Nicole pointed out, some 20 years ago. We had little intention or idea that it would expand into a series of symposiums, but we're delighted that it has. Our initial purpose was to address the issues of how urban planning could address environmental problems in cities and urban regions. So the first focus was on how do we move from dealing with intrusive land uses and their effects on sensitive land uses through separation, which of course was the traditional form of planning, to dealing with these, mitigating these, reducing these, as we go to higher densities to accommodate urban growth, and as we go to mixed uses for various purposes, including reducing trip lengths. So that was the initial focus of this whole enterprise. A second purpose, a second mission was to try to put flesh on the bones of the first Rio Earth Summit, to try to come up with cases, generalizable information, experiences, but concrete ways of carrying into action the kinds of desired futures that the policies from the Earth Summit, the first Rio meeting, postulated. And of course, Rio plus 20 having just occurred, we find ourselves still in this position of needing to identify ways of actually carrying out the desires, the missions, the intent of enterprises of this sort. Coming from the United States, of course, I have to take some responsibility for our own country's dragging feet in terms of developing those policies. So the success of this series has largely depended on this interest in learning from cases, in learning from experiences, in learning from generalizable research, in learning from the interactions between people, researchers, public officials, planners, representatives of non-governmental organizations, and learning through interactions, not only the formal interactions in the plenary sessions and the track sessions, but learning through informal discussions that occur during breaks and at the social functions. So this is a major function, I think, of this whole initiative. Finally, as Nicole pointed out, we try to address or carry some of this information to a larger audience through a publication series, which has been rather successful beyond our expectations, especially through Ashgate Publishing, but also through other publishers. So at this point, we have something like 26 books, not based just on the papers that are presented at symposia like this, but works that others have generated, which have made contributions to the mission of this enterprise. So again, I wish you a very good 4 days, a very effective, successful 4 days, and of course that's going to really depend on your willingness to enter into discussion, enter into controversy with what you hear, and through interaction during the coming days. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Don. I'd now like to invite the Honourable Craig Knowles, President of the Planning Research Centre here at the University of Sydney and Chair of the absolutely extraordinary Murray-Darling Basin Authority, not to mention former New South Wales Minister of Planning and many other roles. Thank you, Craig.
I'm conscious of Nicole's exhortation to keep to time. I'll be brief too. Don, thanks for your thanks, and Michael, thanks for the welcome, and I also pay my respect to the traditional owners, the Gadigal and Eora Nations. It's terrific to be here, and thank you all for making the journey. For those of you who have travelled a long way, thanks especially. As President of the Planning Research Centre here in the faculty, we've been around for 50 years, since 1964. We've been variously over many of those decades actively involved in the urban policy debates that shape this city and indeed this nation. Our directors, Ed Blakely being one of them, John Turner, who I don't think is here. If he is, give us a wave, John. There he is here. Over many, many years have been variously public commentators, private guiders, often of ministers, telling them perhaps what they need to know rather than what they might want to hear, and generally participating and more frequently stimulating the contest of ideas around the vital issues that you're all here to discuss. And so it's a great delight to join with Don in thanking you all for adding to that rich history that has come out of this place over all of those decades. It's not trite, it's a matter of fact to say that it's really timely that you're here in Sydney. Nicole mentioned very briefly, and I will localise my remarks very briefly, to the fact that there is a new planning system being contemplated right as we speak. A government green paper in the public domain for public consultation as we speak, following a lengthy review, with legislation for a new system promised sometime early next year. Pretty quick process, actually, when you think about the complexities of what's involved. It's designed, as Nicole said, to replace at its time a world-class piece of environmental planning legislation, the UPE10 Act, which, for all sorts of reasons, has grown too many barnacles, has passed its use-by date, and is in need of replacing rather than further amending. Now, that creates an enormous challenge to communities, it creates enormous challenges for governments, and it creates, I assert, an enormous opportunity for the professions that are represented in this room. In 1979, in the lead up to it, and there are people old enough in this room to remember, it was gatherings such as this that fired up the engines of what then became to be regarded as a world-class piece of legislation. The question today is, are similar things happening to further empower the next piece of legislation, which is likely to last us maybe not 30 years, but will shape this place and this state for generations of our citizens. And so your active involvement is critical, because governments these days, especially state governments, are doing it tough. It's not just the GFC, there are structural issues rather than cyclical issues in the Australian circumstance that mean that the funding available for the provision of infrastructure, for addressing environmental problems, for underpinning social equity equations are perhaps less available to governments than they once were, at least at a state government level. How governments respond these days is more likely to be about the latest fashion rather than the long-term policy frameworks and imperatives that should underpin good policy and good legislation. At the moment, as part of an old economy, New South Wales is under the pump on the economic development front. Jobs, infrastructure and backlogs and the need for new investment. And so it won't surprise you to learn that, that there does appear to be somewhat of a bias in what is now rolling out in our part of the world, a bias towards a planning instrument as an economic development tool. Not necessarily a bad thing, but in what context? Back in '79, those of you who were involved in those debates remembered the Herculean debates about balancing social, environmental and economic perspectives and needs, striking the balance, recognising that they weren't competing agendas, but in fact complementary agendas going like a hand in a glove. To digress just for a moment, my work at the Murray-Darling Basin Authority is just about that. The Act I operate under contemplates the resetting of the balance of water use from consumptive to environmental sustainability to consider the optimisation of social, economic and environmental outcomes. So that troika of objectives remains paramount in much of our national legislation. What will this new Act bring? And so it is timely, and it's not a trite statement to say that. It is timely because your efforts, your debates, the contest of your ideas will assist the policymakers in this room, the people from the faculties, from the US Studies Centre, all of the people who have an interest in the well-being of our city in the broadest context of that term, to do a better job. I believe that the current government wants to produce yet again a world-class piece of planning legislation. That has to be the objective of any public representative of any government, anywhere, anytime. But to get it right, they need your help. Please use the next 4 days to be an active participant. By all means, enjoy yourself, but as Don said, take the time to express yourself. Get involved, have your say. Sydney needs that. New South Wales needs that. Australia needs that. In conclusion, and in the context of Nicole tapping her watch, and I don't want to get the bell, in the words of Primo Levi, or to paraphrase Primo Levi, if not us, who? And if not now, when? There is no parallel universe. There is a new planning system being designed for a world-class city as we speak. With all your professional training, all your hopes and aspirations, all of your perspectives, be it from the environmental side of the equation or the economic side of the equation, or from my background, the social justice and equity considerations of the equation, here is your chance. It may not come again. Enjoy your symposium, put it to work, and make it work for the citizenry of my city, my state, and my country. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. You can see in New South Wales we've been quite lucky actually with the calibre of our former planning ministers. Well done. And our current planning minister is similarly enthusiastic and also well briefed. I have to end the welcomes now because I'm going to move us to the next and to the first keynote session. We've got 3 outstanding speakers, but I'm actually going to allow the chair of that session, Elisabeth Hamin, to introduce them. But let me introduce Elisabeth Hamin. Oh, there she is. I've known Elisabeth Hamin by reputation since the mid-1990s through her work, which at the time was unique and seminal, on the relationships between urban planning, biodiversity and conservation landscapes. She's now at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, where she heads up the regional planning program. But she's subsequently built a reputation for local planning and sustainability, most recently calling attention to the potential conflicts between planning for climate change mitigation and planning for climate change adaptation, and the need to resolve those potential conflicts through local planning. So she's very well placed to chair our first keynote session for UPE10, which of course is the starting point for our discussions. Thanks, Elisabeth.
Thanks, Nicole. Am I on? Mic'd? Yes, good. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's such a pleasure to see you again. My job is a really good job. I'm just introducing people. So I'm going to start with our first speaker today will be Dean Frederick Steiner, who I hope he doesn't mind if I call him Fritz. It's really my pleasure to bring him forward. Fritz has been a leading light in integrating planning and ecology throughout his career, but because his background is both in planning and landscape, and he's really been a crucial component in the effort to bring physical design back into planning. And that I think has been really important in keeping the field relevant and moving forward, and certainly has helped form the responses to the ability to respond to climate change as we go forward. He is currently Dean of the School of Architecture and the Henry Rockwell Chair in Architecture at the University of Texas, Austin. For those who haven't been there, the official motto for Austin is "Keep Austin Weird," so it's a good place to visit. Remarkably, even while he's been dean, he manages to write, which is really quite an accomplishment, and he's published important texts such as his most recent work with Danilo Palazzo, hope I got the pronunciation right, Urban Ecological Design. He keeps a hand in practice as well through work with Land Trust and Regional Planning NGO. He's really had too many honors for me to stand up here and go through. You can look in his bio online, and I encourage you to do so. It's particularly nice for me to introduce Fritz because we had the same PhD advisor at the University of Pennsylvania, Ann Strong, and it's always good to sort of see heritage go forward because eventually as academics, that's sort of what we have, right, as our students. So with that, I will welcome Fritz Steiner. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Elisabeth. Thank you for the organizers of this event, Nicole, Ed, and others. and it's wonderful to be here. With that, I'll launch in. The topic of my talk is focusing on the planet and its vulnerable nature and how that relates to cities and energy. And it might be seem a little bit odd to start a talk about the future of the city with a pile of wood chips in western Pennsylvania. This is a pile of wood chips in western Pennsylvania. This is where United Flight 93 crashed on September 11, 2001. And of course, those of you who are familiar with that day know that that plane was headed towards the city. The target of the terrorist attacks on September 11th were cities. And even to this day, one can walk on that site and find bits of the airplane, bits of bone from the crash site. And soon after the event, our National Park Service organized a competition for a memorial at Flight 90 at the crash site. And I was fortunate to be one of 5 finalists to design that memorial. And so part of our overall scheme was to turn the landscape, which had been a strip mined area, into the memorial and to replicate the path of the flight that day. So this is basically part of our scheme. One of our ideas was to, and the reason I entered the competition is my brother is an FBI agent, and was an FBI agent, and helped coordinate the investigation after he was stationed in San Francisco and helped coordinate the investigation. One of our ideas that survived is was called the FBI Overlook, and it's where the FBI conducted the investigation. That's my brother on your right. He also, or your left. He also, for the Americans, was the agent that arrested the Unabomber, and here he is standing in front of the Unabomber's house. So these are some images of. We kind of overthought. We were academics. We had this idea that we would use red maples because red maples bloom are really spectacular color in September in western Pennsylvania. But we overthought, we thought, well, we'd show what the red maples would look like in the middle of winter. One of our competitors, Tom, the winner, was not shy about red maples. He put all kinds of red maples and put them in the fall when they were most colorful. And so this is part of the winning scheme. And another one. And this past September 11th was the 10th anniversary. Our former President Clinton came with Vice President Biden and former President Bush to dedicate the memorial. And they, so both political parties came together to memorialize the event. And what I'm going to do is go through a series of natural disasters, starting with one Ed Blakely's very familiar with, Katrina. Of course, this is the hurricane that landed in New Orleans. We're very familiar with the devastation that occurred after that event. This is a image of the tracks of hurricanes that have occurred in the Gulf Coast since the 1860s to the beginning 2000s, basically to illustrate that there's every place in the Gulf Coast around the United States and in the Caribbean and Mexico is prone to hurricanes. This is another image that basically steps back and looks at the east coast of the United States. So after Katrina, there was the recovery efforts that began, the loss of life and property, the impact not only on humans but on other species, the cleanup, and the rescue, and this is in some of those. There was also a temporary memorial for the victims. So, like the September 11th, there's this grieving period that we humans go through, and then we start to memorialize those who've lost. A very similar occurrence occurred in Sichuan province in China. The earthquakes that occurred there in 2008. The rescue of people. The only other competition I've ever entered was this one, to do a memorial. This is, for those of you who are Chinese, know that these are the characters for the son and daughter in Chinese. And so our idea was that everyone who died through that event was someone's son and daughter. So we would memorialize that through using stones and putting son and daughter, the images of son and daughter, which we got a nice honorable mention for. And I'll go through some other well-known disasters from around the world. We have the tsunamis in Japan, the destruction that resulted there. We have tornadoes that have occurred in the American Midwest and South, mudslides and floods in Brazil. In Brazil, there's the equivalent of a Katrina every year in terms of loss of life and property. These are the ones that occurred in 2011. More images from the flooding in Rio. And of course, the floods that occurred here in Australia last year in the north. This is at the height of the flooding. 2011 was an especially bad year for floods around the world, in Thailand, in Brazil, in Australia. And yes, one of the more famous creatures from this continent. The earthquake that occurred in Haiti. I was in Turkey just a few weeks ago, and the earthquakes that occurred in Turkey in 2011, again, very similar and new earthquake legislation. Much of the new planning legislation in Turkey is dealing with how to address the problem with earthquakes. And in my own state of Texas, there was drought and wildfires this last year as well. Incredible drought that had a huge impact on our state. This, you can see, is a map of the United States. In 2011, almost the whole state of Texas at the height was in a drought. The state of Texas lost 10% of our trees during this drought. That's a 500 million trees. 500 million trees were lost during the drought in Texas. Here's another image of that. Again, the impact of the drought. And the loss of trees, that was before the wildfires came. And after the terrible drought, we had a series of wildfires. These are just to the east of Austin, Texas, in a county called Bastrop. This is what that destruction looked like from the air. And this is a plan that our colleagues at Texas A&M did for Bastrop dealing with wildfires. tremendous, actually, it was very accurate in its description of where the fires would occur, what the extent of the fires would be. But unfortunately, the plan was not ignored. So one of my points here is that there is a reaction that we have to disasters. There's the rescue, the restoration, the rebuilding, and the remembrance. But true recovery requires, I think, another level of planning. And I think that that's one of the challenges we face in climate change. One of the impacts of climate change is the increase globally of extreme weather events. And in my country, in a normal year, there are around 3 to 4 extreme weather events that create $1 billion in damage. In 2011, there were 14. So the number of extreme weather events are increasing. How we deal with floods, how we deal with drought, how we deal with wildfire is an important issue for us to address. Certainly, those of you in Australia are very familiar with this, and these are wildfires in Australia. The impact of drought and wildfire and flooding to the Australian landscape is not unfamiliar. I thought I was a little bit out on a limb with some of this until the American Institute of Architects publication put this on the cover, urging architects to come to the rescue for natural disasters. And my argument would be, well, but so should the planners. We should be there as well. This is a quote that I like quite a bit, and I think it talks to the resiliency of our species. I saw it for the first time at the Darwin Research Center at the Galapagos Islands. So it was on a T-shirt, and it was attributed to Charles Darwin. It turns out Darwin never wrote this, even though the Charles Darwin Center was selling T-shirts with this quote. I don't know who wrote it originally, but I like it because I think we are a resilient species, and planning and design are two of our most important tools for planning. And so how do we advance planning and design and adaptation? I like to look back at my own hometown. I'm not a Texan. Those of you who are familiar with Texan accents probably picked that up by now. I'm from Dayton, Ohio. And Dayton, Ohio was completely destroyed by a flood in 1913. And these are some images from the flood in Dayton. Martial law was declared, and the response was this conservancy was created, and the idea was this is the extent of that area, was to create a series of earthen dams behind which easements were purchased, and flooding would be controlled afterwards. And this shows what that system, a really innovative engineer named Arthur Morgan conceived it. So there was these series of earthen dams. The idea was the river would flow naturally during normal times, and then during a time of floods, the gates would close, and this whole area behind would be allowed to flood, and in the interim, the area would be used for recreation and agricultural uses. 1913, the city of Dayton has never experienced a flood since. It's been a very effective system. I grew up along those streams and rivers camping, and so it's been a very successful effort. This is one of my mentors, Ian McHarg, and many of you know McHarg wrote a wonderful book called Design with Nature. The slides aren't quite working. I think some of them require a little bit extra memory, and so this is a man who you're less familiar with than McHarg. His name is George Mitchell. Among other things, by the way, George Mitchell invented hydrologic fracking. Kind of an interesting side note. He's what we call in Texas an oil man. He was a Greek immigrant and made a fortune in oil, and then turned his attention to urban planning and developed this new town north of Houston, Texas called the Woodlands, and engaged McHarg in the design of the Woodlands. And the Woodlands, basic idea was, this is the early 70s, is to protect the woodlands, protect the natural drainage systems. They used what McHarg called his layer cake system of understanding the geology, the hydrology, the soils, and so on of the site, and to map that information, to understand that as natural processes. This is something that could be used today to illustrate low-impact development. It's again from the Woodlands Report in 1973, basically making the argument if you control the natural drainage systems, you can then manage stormwater more effectively and reduce flooding. And this is one image of what the woodlands looks like today. And it's kind of fun to Google places, and if you Google the woodlands, it looks like an odd turtle amongst the suburban sprawl of Houston. It's a very different structure than the rest of Houston. McHarg was also involved in Austin, Texas in the late 1970s, which was called the Lake Austin Plan, and used a very similar approach, the mapping of the geology and the soils and so forth, and looked at areas where the best areas were to develop and so on. And that plan was used in, or that information was used in Austin's 1979 comprehensive plan. Until just a few weeks ago, this was the last comprehensive plan that was formally adopted by the city. Very much based on a McHarg approach to planning. And if you look at that 79 plan, you'll see these McHargian-inspired maps, and some of them that McHarg and his colleagues did themselves, showing places that should grow from 1979 on. I live right there. So I live in an area that was inside the city limits of Austin and targeted for growth in this 1979 plan. This is a greenway about 2 minutes from where I live. I just thought I'd throw in a couple of images. This is my house. So we have these wonderful protected trees. Bluebonnets are the state flower of Texas. We really freaked our neighbors out when we put natural vegetation in the yard. She was afraid snakes would come anyway. So now everyone in the fall comes and has their pictures taken with our bluebonnets. It's been our yard has been declared a certified wildlife habitat, and you can't see this very well. This is a Texas possum, not as pretty as Australian possums, but there he is. This is a raccoon coming, and part of what I've been involved in, this is downtown Austin, this is approximately where I live right in here, is we've been working to expand this greenway that was developed as a result of the McHarg plan in the 70s out into a larger system. This is about 34 miles. We also, about 6 weeks ago now, passed a new comprehensive plan. The first one, as I mentioned, since 1979. It was passed unanimously by City Council. And it was based on a larger regional planning effort that we've been engaged in for the last 12 years now. And a key component of our plan is to concentrate development in these growth areas, to protect the aquifer, which is this area here, and then to develop along rail and highway corridors. We're also, Tom Wright is going to mention the HUD sustainability program. We're also involved in that, and part of what we're doing there is looking at these centers and how they can be developed in a more effective way. And looking forward, I think one of the tools that we can use is the concept of ecosystem services. I think it's a very important concept. And the basic idea of ecosystem services is to value the things in nature that we've not given monetary value to in the past. And these are some examples of ecosystem services. This is from the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos, 97% of the islands are a national park. The area around it is the marine areas are also protected. The ecosystem services provided provide great economic benefit for Ecuador, as well as scientific benefit. The World Resources Institute has done an analysis of the ecosystem services that the mangroves and the reefs in Belize provide, and they found a third of Belize's GNP comes from essentially those mangroves and reefs. In New York City, New York City was faced with a very expensive water treatment plant, and what the city decided to do instead was to buy large parts of the Hudson River watershed and use those areas for water for the city of New York. So I think there's very many examples of this growing idea of ecosystem services. These are some images from the Galapagos Islands of great creatures there. Not nearly as many poisonous creatures as in Australia, but unique ones too. This is one of my favorites. It's called a blue-footed booby. Also really unique vegetation. Other kinds of ecosystem services are those provided by wind. And this sort of cross-section shows that, and I think one of the challenges is how instead of using and depleting ecosystem services, how can we design cities and regions to create ecosystem services? And these are some of sort of a transect that shows different ecosystem services that are related to different land uses. We in this case is the American Society of Landscape Architects, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, and the U.S. Botanic Garden has been involved in applying ecosystem services to something we call sustainable sites. And what sustainable sites is the Americans are familiar with something called LEED, which is a building certification system. Other countries have similar system, Green Star or Energy Star systems. And we found that the LEED system in the United States did a really good job of green buildings, but didn't do a very good job of the areas outside of buildings. So what we decided to do was basically create LEED for the outdoor environment. So everything outside of a building, and we use this ecosystem services concept as a basis, and this is part of the argument that landscapes are using lots of energy, and they can be used instead to mitigate climate, and so again, these are some of the arguments we used about the use of pesticides, water, and so forth. And this is the use of concept of sustainability in the Sustainable Sites Initiative. So as I mentioned, green building, the LEED system has transformed green building in the United States, but what we're trying to do is do a similar system for landscapes. We use these principles in designing the system, And the basic idea is to advance what we call regenerative design. And it's a point system, so based on an analysis of soils, water, materials, and so on in the landscape, you can get different ratings. I'm not going to obviously go through all of it, but this gives you an idea of the structure of the system. And the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects have asked to adapt this for Australia. So we've worked with several other countries, but the Australians are going to be the first to apply it. And we're in what's called a pilot stage. We're at 150 pilots right now, mostly in the United States, a couple in Canada, one in Spain, and I have no idea why one in Iceland. After the banks collapsed there, I guess they needed to do something, so they're going through the pilot stage with one project in Iceland. These are the kinds of projects that we're looking at with the Sustainable Sites Initiative. A big emphasis on the reuse of existing sites, a broad range of sizes, and where we are in the process, as I mentioned, we're in the pilot stage. We'll finish in 2013, and then that system will be available. We're working with the U.S. Green Building Council to make it both part of LEED but also a standalone system. And for more information, that's where you can get it. What I thought I'd do is just show a couple examples of projects where this concept is playing out. This is one from, it's called the Friends Select School. As a footnote, this is where the Obama children go to school. This is where Hillary Clinton went to school as well. It's a school that Karen Timberlake are the architects, Andrew Pogon, the landscape architects. So the idea was to turn the whole school into an environmental learning opportunity. And the roof, everything from the rooftop, I'm particularly taken by sort of central courtyard is turned into a water garden where water is cleaned and it's used as a demonstration for children to how water can be used more effectively. And this shows sort of the scheme of the rain gardens, where water is collected and so on. These aren't the Obama children, but two other children enjoying that landscape. Some other examples of urban examples of regenerative systems. This is Gaswork Park in Seattle, where Don Miller is from. An old gasworks that had been turned into a park. A similar effort in Germany, an old factory that has been reclaimed as a park. And also amazing sort of urban restoration projects like this one in Korea, where this highway that had been built by the Japanese through the heart of Seoul was changed into a creek area. And it's a fabulous area. A similar effort in in Madrid. This is the Madrid-Rio project, where a whole old highway project has been converted into a park connecting parts of Madrid. A similar effort is underway in Mexico City. A similar situation with a highway that's been they're proposing to take out the highway and put in a stream very similar both to Madrid and to Seoul. And these are the Mexico City. Now going back to the United States, this is a project in Brooklyn. It's called the Sponge Park. It was actually a firm that my daughter works for called D-Land Studio. Real gritty part of Brooklyn. And the idea is to turn this old canal system into an amenity for the community by collecting water and using water collection as a form of restoration, and these are some of the images. It's always, you know, in the United States you have a successful project when a company called, an Austin-based company called Whole Foods moves in. It's something called the Whole Foods effect. So Whole Foods is moving into this area, so this old gritty Brooklyn Canal is being converted into a wonderful amenity. This is another project I was involved in Phoenix, turning the city dump into an environmental education center. Part of my thesis here is that I think a new aesthetic is necessary for the future of the city. This is sort of my sort of rough definition of what that new aesthetic may be. And I think I was thinking when we were being blessed this morning, it's very similar, I suppose, to the Aboriginal definition of the world here. Just two more quick projects, and then I'm going to jump up in scale and be real quick to wrap up. How am I doing? Okay. Two other New York City projects, a lot happening in the city of New York under Mayor Bloomberg's leadership. One is this one called the Brooklyn Bridge Project. This is Brooklyn Heights, one of the sort of wonderful parts of New York City. If you've seen Woody Allen movies with views of Manhattan, they're actually mostly taken from Brooklyn. There's this expressway here, and what Michael Van Valkenburg was faced with was how do you restore this area, turn it into a park, protect the views, protect from the sound of the expressway, and create amenity for the city. And I think he's done a pretty marvelous job. These are some of the analysis that their firm did of the Brooklyn waterfront. This is one that policymakers understand right away. It's more expensive here to develop than here. And then these are some of the plans that were developed, and I'm sorry you can't see that very well, but it's a very popular park in New York. Another example is the High Line, and the High Line, it was an abandoned elevated rail line running through Lower Manhattan, and the Regional Plan Association and the Friends of the High Line argued that this area should be turned into an amenity for the city. So a design competition was held, and James Corner Field Operations and Diller Scofidio won the competition. These are some of the drawings for the High Line. The only thing that I think is different between the drawings for the High Line and the actual High Line is there's actually more people using it than were photoshopped into the original. So these are this is from the plan for the High Line, and these are some images of what the High Line looks like today. A very popular amenity. The idea to turn infrastructure, abandoned infrastructure, into amenity. I've heard about 3 times since I've come to Sydney that there's ideas to turn the monorail system into a High Line. It looks a little skinny to me. It would be like a zip line version of the High Line, but maybe you could do a zip line High Line with the monorail. A wonderfully popular area. It's the areas around the High Line itself are being appropriated by artists and others. And 2 phases done. Everyone who visits it wants a High Line in their city. And I'm going to end a little bit by going way up in scale and national level planning. Tom Wright is going to address later America 2050. And one aspect of America 2050 is Bob Yarrow of Regional Plan Association and I looked at the future of the United States, and what are the areas that should be protected? If the cities are growing, what about the relationship to areas that need to be protected? This is a map. The green splotches were done by the National Park Service in Philadelphia in the 1980s. They put together this sort of wish list of what were the important landscapes left to be protected. This was supposed to be the Texas Hill Country. It really should be over here. But it was a pretty good map. The red areas are the areas that the Obama administration has protected. A good effort, long overdue, but you can see the gap between what should be protected and what is being protected. And by the way, the Chinese are already doing this. Kung Jung-yu and his colleagues at Peking University have developed a national strategy for landscape protection for China. So Yarrow and I, through the auspices of the America 2050, suggested a national conservation strategy for the United States. This map of the United States shows 11 megaregions, and these 11 megaregions will capture 80% of the population growth and economic growth in the United States in the next 30 years. I live in one of those, the so-called Texas Triangle, and this is Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, and San Antonio. And if you look at our growth trends and where the state of Texas, one of the fastest growing states in the United States, most of that growth is occurring in the Texas Triangle. If we look, we could do similar maps for other places in the world, but this is the yellow spots. If you can see, the yellow spots are the urbanized areas. This is 1940, this is 1950, 1960, 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, kind of where we are today, where we're going in 2020 and 2030. If we were a group of physicians looking at x-rays rather than a group of urban planners looking at the landscape, this would be a bit alarming. Yarrow and I and others suggested this national approach to landscapes, and unfortunately we haven't had the funding to do the whole thing, but the Regional Plan Association has moved ahead with the Northeast, and you can see this just came out in February. And I'll just give you sort of a quick rundown of the GIS maps that the Regional Plan Association has developed, again using a very McCarthyan GIS approach. And these are some of those maps. This one I like, it's because of wind power. Addressing climate change. I think that in addition to the wonderful GIS maps, they also mapped the organizations and what the organizations are doing with various issues. So these are organizations in the northeastern United States. These are the issues that are being addressed, and you can see urban growth being at the top. And so this mapping starts to map organizations with issues, as well as what are the initiatives that are being done to protect landscapes in the Northeast, and this was resulted from that. And I've also looked at subregions within the northeastern United States and come up with this map. This is Lower Manhattan. It's from an exhibit a couple years ago called Rising Currents, and the Rising Currents exhibit looked at sea level change and how New York City would have to adapt. Again, this is an image that was done by D-Land Studio, and if you look closely, you can start to see things that are now in Lower Manhattan aren't there anymore, and they've been replaced by greenways and a new estuary system. With that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I'll turn it back over to Elisabeth to introduce the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Hi. The first thing I need to do is apologize for Will Steffen. He has been trapped in the fog, literally, and so his flight arrival is delayed. He'll be with us at lunchtime, but he's very apologetic for that. We will that's the bad news. The good news is that's going to leave us some time to actually do Q&A from the audience. So, so develop some questions. With this, it is my distinct honor to introduce Tom Murphy, who's had a distinguished career as a politician and a researcher, moving ideas into action, which, as we all know, is no small feat. He served 3 terms as mayor of Pittsburgh in the United States. Pittsburgh is a city that had a traumatic deindustrialization in the 1970s. I come from Cleveland. We had the same thing, and it was rough. One of the things that has been really remarkable about Mr. Murphy's career is that he's been able to encourage the sorts of reinvestment that have been required to overcome the deindustrialization of the city and turn it back into a place where people really want to live. And he's had an astonishing level of success at that. In fact, Cleveland is a little jealous, but you know, what are you going to do? So he is currently the Canizaro Klingbeil, I hope I got that pronunciation right, family chair for urban development at the Urban Land Institute. Now, the Urban Land Institute is a very interesting group. It is funded by developers, but it's designed to really put forward good planning and progressive projects. So it's a really wonderful example of how to encourage good development in cities. It's a great organization. And with that, I'm really excited to hear what Mr. Murphy has to say.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here and to be moving around a little bit. It's pretty chilly, isn't it? As was said, I come from Pittsburgh, a city that was once known as hell with the lid off. It was the most environmentally degraded city in America, one that was the center of industrial might of the United States through World War II and after the war. And in a relatively short period of time, the city lost, when we didn't know the word globalization of the steel industry caused the mills in Pittsburgh, the oldest mills in the world, to collapse and to be replaced by mills in Korea and Germany and other places that were more modern. And the results were that Pittsburgh was faced with huge population losses as people left. 500,000 people left the region between 1970 and 1990. These are largely young people moving away because they couldn't see a future for themselves. The environment was as bad as you would have imagined with 100 years of heavy industrial use. The water, the air, and the land were badly polluted. Really, the story of Pittsburgh is a story of civic partnership. One where the public and the civic leadership, the business leadership came together long before I was mayor and Ed Blakely at the time was a young consultant. It was hard to help think through how does Pittsburgh redefine itself. I believe that every city in the world is really in many ways facing the same kind of challenge, and it is a huge opportunity for all of you to begin to shape a different vision of how the cities and its natural resources work together. As Fritz mentioned, Pittsburgh is one of many examples. Pittsburgh is a city of 3 major rivers, and those 3 rivers come together, and up until the 1930s there were serious floods. And I have to say, in the 1930s, there was a whole effort to better integrate the city's development with the rivers, and there was a series of dams built upriver, but the city enacted at the time a very aggressive floodplain management plan that controlled development in the floodplains of the city. And when I became mayor and wanted to develop, I tried to override the planners. and had big arguments with the planners in the city. And then 2 years into my time as mayor, we had a big flood. And everything that had been built since the 1930s, where nothing was impacted by the high water we had in 1996, because the planners were vigilant in how people built and where they built, and they protected the land, and they were able to push back this politician who wanted to do bigger developments in the floodplains of Pittsburgh, and the planners were right. And I think that's the story that I think you need to take with urgency and passion, is that cities need to learn to live with their environment, not try to overcome it. There's a wonderful book called Rising Tide. Ed Blakely is well aware of it. It's written about the 1927 flood of the Mississippi River. Sounds boring, but it is a remarkable book to read about sort of the arrogance of the Corps of Engineers in America and civic leadership of thinking they could control the Mississippi River. And the unintended consequences of that arrogance, of how it had shaped the policy of 100 years that Ed Blakely then needed to go back to New Orleans and try to fix, because we believed that we could control nature, and maybe for 10 years we can, and maybe for 20 years we can, and maybe for 100 years we can, but we're not going to succeed. And I think we're at this moment in time, reminded every day somewhere in the globe that we're not going to succeed in that battle, and that we need to understand how to live with the forces. That's what Fritz pointed out to us. And I think our ability to integrate that into how we build our cities, now even more urgent, as we're seeing more extreme weather. And in our country, the huge debate, which is unnecessary, going on about the impact of climate change. For many cities, we watch coastally in the United States, where 50% of the population of the United States lives within 50 miles of a coast, of almost every year or two, roads being washed away and bridges being destroyed, and we are spending hundreds of millions of dollars to rebuild those every year. That, because we're unwilling to make the difficult decision. So what I bring is a huge respect for your profession and the efforts underway. I bring that as a politician, because what we are, at the end of the day, what you are trying to do is to get people like me to see the world in a different kind of way. And the hardest thing in the world to do, and Fritz, whether it was Darwin who said it or not, is the hardest thing in the world to do for us in some ways is to change. And in politics particularly, that is very difficult to, because we've done things a certain way. There's a constituency for doing that way, and so the ability to change it becomes very difficult. And that's the moment in time I think we're at right now, is I think we have an opportunity because of the discussion and because of the leadership out of the planning and the architectural professions, is that we are more open to willing to begin to make the kind of changes that don't try to overpower nature, but to live with it. And that's the door that is open for all of us now. That this conference is so important in not only, I think, giving you new ideas and senses of what's going on in the rest of the world, but it is also important in understanding that that this urgency exists to begin to think about how we integrate our areas of the world and the climate and nature into how we develop. Pittsburgh is a great example of that. We went from a city that had its riverfronts completely filled with industry to one now that is a city that has its riverfronts converted to parks, and it has created huge value. And for me, what was a really interesting thing when we began to first talk about creating a park on the rivers, you need to know we all grew up in Pittsburgh with our mothers telling us two things: be home before the streetlights come on. And my mother would always say, never go near those rivers. She said, if you go in those rivers, you're going to melt. And so we grew up with the idea of the rivers not being accessible to us. And now we have a 30-mile park along the rivers in Pittsburgh. And when we first proposed that, everybody remembered what their mother said. So people said, what a waste of money. Why? Nobody's going to ever go there. Now there, and you see it. You see it when you create it. The High Line is a great example. There are thousands, if not millions, of people every year now using the riverfronts of Pittsburgh to commute, to enjoy nature, to fish. We find that hard to believe even today that people are fishing. So it is an opportunity to redefine cities. If you figure out how to take advantage of the natural resources you have, and you see that now more and more. And so the ability of you to influence policymakers, to sort of open our eyes, people that have the power to make the kind of changes, become the really important piece of the conversation. I think the ideas are there, the creativity is there. It is now, how do you change policy? How do you understand the politics of this? To change policy becomes a very important role. And I think that ability to communicate these ideas into shaping policy is more opportune now than we've seen in many, many years. And so I hope that you are able to take advantage of that. With that, I think that Fritz and I might take some questions.
So since I'm up here, I get to go first. Thanks for your patience. I've read a number of adaptation plans that municipalities have written. And they're great, particularly in the first half where they're identifying what the risks are and the vulnerabilities and the challenges. And then many of them sort of drift off when it starts to talk about implementation. And so I have sort of so there's that. And then an additional observation I'd like to make, and then I'm going to turn this into a question for our speakers, is that I think what we may need to do is address this connection between improved resilience and more livable environments. To go back to your comment about how do we actually encourage policymakers to take on this agenda. It can't be just a negative approach, but it also has to be identifying the positive outcomes from changes we can make. I hope that makes a little sense, because my question to my speakers is, how do we move from the plans to the implementation? Because I don't think we figured that out yet.
And that's the point. So I run for mayor. Any politician who runs for office runs on a platform of three things: jobs, at least in America, jobs, lower crime, lower taxes. Nowhere is it mentioned about floodplains or parks so how do you go from jobs, crime, and taxes to building a great environmental city? How does that happen? Where does that become the priority? The reality is it becomes the priority because you need to be loudmouths. You need to understand that your job in shaping the vision needs to include being the advocate, of understanding the system of how decisions are made in the political realm, whether it's in Australia or in the United States, of how those decisions are made. You need to be, besides brilliant designers and planners, you need to be Machiavelli. You need to understand how you move that. And so in my view, for cities to be really successful world-class cities, they need a bold vision. They need leadership that is willing to embrace risk. But they need the institutional capacity to deliver that. And that's the implementation of how you empower that institutional capacity to deliver things. And it is that vision that you can help create that will drive the implementation. And it is understanding how, in a very sophisticated and effective way, you communicate that vision so that the elected officials sort of see it as something that can be hugely successful for them. Then to shift the resources to that.
I agree. But I found that one of the most useful tools is positive examples. It's always useful to show something can be done. The
problem is whoever the first is that has none, right?
Right, yes. Yeah, and that's where the leadership and risk-taking is very important.
Right.
I think Mayor Bloomberg in New York City is a great example of an amazing risk-taker and a leader with a high line in projects like that. It was, now everybody wants that, but I think it's that example, that positive example, and being able to show that these things are possible. I think a lot of times what may be missed in giving the positive example, I certainly didn't talk about it in the time I had, is sort of the policy context at which allows an example to occur. The High Line would not have occurred unless the Regional Plan Association and other groups stepped in and created a policy framework to allow it to happen. So I think that's also very important, is not only showing the positive example, but what was the leadership, what was the policy that allowed that to happen, and then how did it positively impact people's lives on a day-to-day basis?
Yes. Ed.
For the mic, one thing the mayor didn't say is the river caught on fire. We have to take advantage of tragedies, in a sense. We were able to replan New Orleans because of the disaster. And people are wondering, why didn't we rebuild the Ninth Ward? Because the Ninth Ward is where the flood's going to happen. And that's we did all those natural habitat maps to show where flooding would occur when the Mississippi straightens out. The Ninth Ward is destination 1 for the Mississippi. So I think we have to use nature as a way of helping us understand how to plan with nature. And sometimes even events like the High Line, tearing it down, arouse people. It's hard to get policymakers' attention without some sort of accident, disaster, or something. I'd just like your guys' comments on that. Is that a correct assessment?
It is in part. I mean, in some ways, I think it's easier to make a change when you have a disaster. It is not always difficult, but I think and Pittsburgh is an example of that, as the steel industry collapsed. And so we had an imperative. In some ways, it was easier for us to make changes than it would be a city that's doing okay. Sydney faces the challenges, it's doing okay. And so the ability to make changes becomes maybe a little bit more difficult. Let me mention one other piece of this conversation, and it's true for every community in the United States, as it is probably here in Sydney, as I have had my conversations. The solutions we're talking about go beyond our sense of governance, is that they are the environmental challenges of Sydney or Pittsburgh or Austin doesn't pay attention to political boundaries. The solutions have to be regional. And so the institutional capacity that permits that kind of conversation, it happens, it might even go beyond states. If you look at Pittsburgh on the map, Pittsburgh is a half hour away from West Virginia and 40 minutes away from Ohio. So our metropolitan area cuts across hundreds of local governments in 3 states. Those boundaries, in the context of what we're talking about, have no meaning whatsoever. And so we've created these artificial barriers that really make it hard for us to try to solve the challenges that we're discussing at this conference, and how regions decide to work together, to cooperate, to build the institutional capacity to get beyond those artificial boundaries becomes a really critical piece of the conversation. It's not only about the environmental issues, it's about transportation and a host of other things. And so that's a big piece of the discussion in the United States, certainly, and I think in a lot of other places in the world, of how all that happens.
There are certainly examples that would support that observation, and 2 that I would suggest is Turkey, which I mentioned, terrible earthquakes, a major rewriting of the urban planning legislation to address natural disasters and earthquake as a result. In China, after the horrible earthquakes and the realization that the building codes were not sufficient, major rewriting of a restructuring of basic way buildings are done in China. But I think it's a very daunting challenge for planners. If we focus a lot on the gloom and doom, which I did at the beginning of my talk, sometimes I think that's abstract to policymakers until they come face to face with it. And I used the example in Texas where a tremendous plan had been done and ignored, and as a result, several people lost their lives, many people lost their homes. And so I think it's a big challenge for us. And it's sad that we sometimes have to wait for a disaster where many people lose their lives and property in order to create an opportunity out of that. But I think with global climate change, there's unfortunately going to be more and more opportunities for us to do that.
Let's take one. I'll go side to side. So.
The almost total absence of any reference to the politics of climate change. I'm just wondering to what extent the politics of climate change, the denial of climate change, is standing in the way of adaptation, at least in terms of those natural disasters that are related to climate change.
Do you want to answer that? Well, one of the challenges my country faces politically, there's a large segment of people who don't believe in science at all, and so there in many ways that's a pretty difficult hurdle to get over. 2 things that we've done, and we in the sense of the U.S. Green Building Council and the green building standards, and what we've tried to do with sustainable sites, is say, okay, you may or may not believe in climate change, but then try to look at other aspects that people may relate to more directly. In the United States, and I think it's similar in Australia and several other countries, 50% of the greenhouse gas production comes from buildings. That's 40% in their use and 10% in construction. It's the same amount of energy. So 50% of energy use and greenhouse gas production comes from buildings. Another 25% comes from transportation systems. So 75% of greenhouse gas production and energy use comes from the built environment. So one argument is, okay, I think that we should be concerned about climate change. If you're not concerned about climate change, are you concerned about energy prices, energy use? That seems to relate to a broader spectrum of people. So we make the argument about energy use. It's expensive. It's getting more expensive. The environmental costs of mining are high. So one way is to, I don't think we should ignore the climate change issue. I think it's very important. But to try to find maybe other areas that capture a broader range of interest. That may be just a very US-centric sort of, although I think there's certainly skeptics of climate change here in Australia as well.
Let me just say what is, I think, has been surprising in the States, at least, because of, as Fritz said, the politics of climate change is poisonous right now, and there has not been, at the national level, certainly any major legislation. Is what's been surprising is the response of the private sector. The development community has broadly begun to adopt different methods of construction. And so you have many of the major corporations in the United States now committed to building green buildings. Major banks, for example, are major bank, one of the top 5 or 6 banks in the country, PNC Bank, advertises themselves as having more green buildings than any other corporation in the world. And that's their TV ads. And so they are, it has become for corporations, I think, both an economic and a public relations opportunity. And so you have the private market moving much more aggressively than I think anybody would have expected without regulation, pretty much. And that is changing the conversation in the United States. Also, as Fritz mentioned, the issues of the cost of transport. Increasingly, people are looking at the purchase of a house, not just in the cost of the house, but the cost of the house plus transportation. Because historically, in the States, people have looked at their housing costs as about 30% of their income monthly. And when you often now, because of the commuting distance and the congestion, people, if you look at housing and transportation costs, your overall monthly resources, maybe 50 or 60% of it is being used just on those 2 items. And so that increasingly has become a part of a conversation about where people are choosing to live. We would assume that for every car you don't have, you could add $100,000 more onto your mortgage. In terms of, that's the money you would be spending annually for a car. Instead of that, you'd be able to put it towards a mortgage. And so increasingly people are making that decision, which is resulting in because of the recession and because of people making choices about where to live, we are seeing a decrease in energy usage for transportation too. So we're really beginning to see the market work in lieu of government action.
Let me add, that's national government, but local governments have been a leader as well. Notably Seattle, Portland, Austin, New York, and Chicago, and a few states, notably California. So there's certainly a lack of national leadership, but for the private sector and local government, and to some extent state government, have been taking the lead with and are being aggressive with climate change policies and actions.
Hi, Peter Sainsbury. Just as regards climate change, I think we can answer Primo Levi's question. If not now, it's not when, it's if not now, never, because it'll be too late.
Right.
But the point I really want to make is about agency and agents. insofar as the discussion's all been about planners and politicians, mayors and developers. But the fact of the matter is, if it had been left to the politicians and the planners, the High Line would never have been built. The High Line wasn't Bloomberg's idea, it wasn't a planner's idea, it was the community's idea, it was 2 or 3 individuals' ideas. And so in terms of action, I just wanted to make the point about the value of community, of individuals in communities, not necessarily mass movements, because it was 2 or 3 individuals who drove the High Line, one of whom is now managing the company that builds and maintains the High Line. And so it's just this point about citizenship and democracy and the place of people in the planning process that I think we must remember at all times. So that's the point I wanted to make. Thank you.
That's a terrific point. There's a movement now called tactical urbanism, which I've become very fond of very grassroots people taking action. But the High Line, there's sort of the myth, these 2 heroic guys, they go up and they take pictures and they're not doing a whole lot with their lives. But if it wouldn't have been for the planners of the Regional Plan Association, there would be no High Line because it would have been torn down. So the planners played a very crucial role in stopping a stupid decision from occurring. I like the myth of the High Line, but planners were not potted plants. They were involved in the discussion to preserve the structure and to enable those 2 wonderful guys to do what they did. So there's a very important context. And in Bloomberg's case, he was smart enough not to get in the way, which is also, I think, a trait of a good politician too, is knowing not when to do something stupid.
And I think that, I mean, your point is what I was trying to make, is that we are at a moment in time when there's an openness to some of this stuff. And so when you're the mayor and you're looking at a budget and you're trying to decide how you're going to spend money, the ability to raise up these issues, to make it an important piece of the kind of investment you want to make for your city, and seeing it in the context of creating great vitality for your city is in some ways spontaneous, but in other ways manufactured, because people understand how well to communicate this idea. And that is, I think, really, you have the ideas. And many of you in your communities, the challenge is, how do you now begin to move that, the High Line being a great example of capturing people's imagination. It is what I would call, who could have imagined moments? I mean, you look at the High Line and you walk on it and you say, who could have imagined something like this in the middle of New York City? It's how do you create those moments? It's a combination of luck, timing, in a very thoughtful communications idea of how you move an idea. And I think that's the next conference you ought to have, is how do you take the kind of ideas that are in this conference that you have and you're working on, and begin to get the kind of embracement that you see with the High Line.
Hello. My question is more towards Mr. Steiner. You mentioned in your talk that the 9/11 memorial in Pennsylvania was on a reclaimed strip mine, and I thought that kind of spoke about what you later spoke about in regards to kind of taking ugly areas and making them beautiful. But knowing a little bit about strip mines in the reclaimed area, I know that they tend to have a lot of issues in terms of stability, mineral content, all sorts of issues in terms of building things on them. So in your talk, how do you deal with these issues on a practical level in talking about revitalization of areas that might have these kinds of challenges?
Well, part of, besides the design we did, There was also, we contributed to an environmental impact statement that addressed the regeneration of those lands and the restoration of those lands. So there were large areas that had been strip mined. They were quite literally poisonous and required, so a lot of our scheme, and actually the winning scheme too, had to do with how do you restore those areas through planting, through other measures. And then we had to deal with the crash site itself, which also had levels of pollution that needed to be dealt with as well. So that was part of the process, was a formal environmental impact statement and a mitigation plan that was done by the National Park Service. So the 5 finalist teams that did the design also contributed to that. And although our team didn't win, I'm happy to say that a lot of our work with the environmental restoration aspects of the plan were incorporated by the Park Service, and that's part of the overall scheme. I like what you said, though, that I think it's very important for us to look at, I think it's really, we need to change our view of aesthetics and sort of look at those ugly, what we used to consider ugly sites and places like strip mines or canals in Brooklyn or rivers that catch on fire, and embrace them and to understand their beauty and how to make them beautiful.
Sadly, that was our last question that we can take. I have a couple words that I might use to wrap up at the risk of simplifying what's been complex and really interesting conversation. Some of the points that I've heard in the presentations and the discussions is that we need to start with a pre-existing policy context that allows good things to happen. And then you have a triggering event which enables you to sort of move forward. Unfortunately, many times that triggering event is a bad thing, but there you go. It's a triggering event, but you need local examples of good design so that you can convince your policymakers that things are possible and show them physically that good things are able to be done. Leadership and vision, communication to capture imagination are also necessary. And then as we move in particular to climate change, we can talk about the co-benefits. Even if we don't use those words, we can talk about the other benefits that climate change actions achieve if we can't talk about climate change. And I wanted to thank our speakers and invite you to go and have some tea.